So we are now recording. The talk that I am going to give today is about some of the geopolitical aspects of this war, and I don't mean this necessarily to be a coherent narrative leading from one thing to another. I want to look at a lot of different aspects of geopolitics. Coming from, I'm a geographer by trade. That's what I did my doctorate in. So I come from a geographical background. And when I talk about geopolitics, a lot of times, a lot of people immediately think of what I call classical geopolitics, the struggle over the control of geographical entities with an international and global dimension and the use of such geographical entities for political advantage, right? Bearded men in these big boardrooms staring at maps, moving the dispositions of armies and deciding the fates of nations and all of this stuff. And that's part of it. But when I talk about geopolitics, when geographers talk about geopolitics, we can also mean a lot of other things. And I think some of those other things are in some senses more interesting than the Congress of Berlin here, or the sort of image of geopolitics that we often have. Geopolitics is also a way of seeing. It's a way of representing the world. And there's a whole stream of geopolitical thinking called critical geopolitics, and it looks like oh no, it's spelled right there. And critical geopolitics explores meanings, it explores representation and the symbols that are bound up with the way that we understand the world. And these symbols, these meanings, these representations can be put forth by a number of different what we call geopolitical agents. And those, of course, can be stuffy old men in boardrooms and states and these kinds of things. But geopolitical agents can also be individuals, you and me. They can be our families, they can be labor unions, protest movements, rebel groups, non-governmental organizations. All sorts of different parties and actors can function as geopolitical agents. They can articulate geopolitical visions and they can push for their realization. Or they can, in some ways, just frame the way that particular geopolitical moments are understood. So how does this sort of relate to the conflict that we are currently witnessing play out? Sorry, I'm going to turn on a timer here so I don't completely go over time. The conflict that we're seeing play out in Ukraine right now. Well, maybe some of the common explanations that you have seen focus on things like NATO expansion, or how the West has pushed Russia into a corner and forced Putin's hand, that Russia has legitimate security concerns. One way that Russia has sort of represented itself geopolitically as being encircled by NATO and these kinds of things. And of course, all of these things are part of it. We can't discount them completely. But there are those, and I'm pointing at John Mearsheimer right now, who has been one of the loudest voices sort of pushing this NATO expansion view all the way back to 2014 in the era of the Euromaidan protests, that the idea of Russian aggression being the primary cause is wrong. He writes that the United States and its European allies share most of the responsibility for the crisis. The taproot of the trouble is NATO enlargement, the central element of a larger strategy to move Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and integrate it into the West. And I highlighted this here because it makes Ukraine, and I think this is very important for the narrative that I'm trying to develop here, it turns Ukraine into kind of a passive object, right? That the West or NATO or the United States or Europe is just moving Ukraine, and Ukraine doesn't really have much agency there. Just recently, in an interview with Isaac Chotiner, Mearsheimer just like last week, sort of recapitulated these ideas. And he argued that what has happened with the passage of time is that we have moved forward to include Ukraine into the West, and again, to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. Of course, this includes more than just NATO expansion. NATO expansion is the heart of the strategy, but it includes EU expansion as well, which is a fairly, I think, striking thing to add there, and includes turning Ukraine, again, Ukraine being a sort of passive geopolitical object here, into a pro-American liberal democracy. And from a Russian perspective, this is an existential threat. And when he was pressed on this, he said, well, this isn't imperialism, this is great power politics, which I think is a rather baffling thing to say, and not necessarily, I think, the win that he thought he was making. But as I think I've made clear, I think some of these kinds of explanations fall into the trap of sort of implicitly justifying something like 19th century imperialism, right? We have privileged spheres of influence. Certain powers like Russia, or even arguably the United States, have sort of a veto power over what their weaker neighbors are allowed to do. And I'm not sure that this is necessarily the kind of world that that we imagined that we were moving into. It certainly denies Russian agency, right? It kind of makes the war itself kind of a preordained thing, that if NATO was doing all of this stuff and the EU was doing all of this stuff, then Russia just didn't really have any choice except to do some war crimes against Mariupol. But more importantly than that, I think it denies Ukrainian agency. If you read anything that Mearsheimer has said about Ukraine, and he's written about it numerous times, again, and even just in the last couple of weeks, Ukraine as a geopolitical actor that has agency vanishes completely. It's just sort of a passive object that imperial powers like Russia and the United States sort of vie for control over. The idea that that Ukraine has legitimate security interests of its own, such as not being invaded, kind of disappear. The idea that Ukrainian people themselves are actors with geopolitical agency is erased entirely. And I think this is very curious because, again, this current crisis didn't just start on February 24th of this year. It goes back at least to 2013 and 2014 during the Euromaidan revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity, as it's often called, and the articulation of the idea of Ruski Mir, or the Russian world. And so what we see playing out from that time and arguably into the present time is two different competing geopolitical visions. And Jerry Kearns, a geographer, has written, of course, the geopolitical visions aren't ever innocent. They're always sort of wishes. They're what we want to happen, but they pose as sort of detached analysis. And so maybe you remember this video called "I Am a Ukrainian" that came out of the Euromaidan revolution. And this woman, Yulia Marashevska, argued, or she made this video, and she said, "I'm on Maidan while it was happening, the central part of my city. I want you to know why thousands of people all over my country are in the streets. And there's only one reason. We want to be free from a dictatorship. We want to be free from the politicians who work only for themselves, who are ready to shoot, beat, and injure people. These people who are here, that is on Maidan, have dignity and they are brave. I want them to live a normal life. We're civilized people, but our government is barbarians. It's not the Soviet Union. We want our courts not to be corrupted. We want to be free." Right? And so the geopolitical vision that Marashevska and the other people who were part of the Revolution of Dignity were trying to articulate was one in which they were trying to look to the EU, right? This was not NATO Maidan, this was Euromaidan. They were interested in freeing themselves, in dignity, and having self-determination. And this is very much counterpoised with the idea of the Ruski Mir, or the Russian world, which is driven by Russian nationalism and imperialist revanchism. So Vladimir Putin, right, in his speech just prior to the war, said, "I would like to emphasize again that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country. It is an inalienable part of our own, that is Russian history, Russian culture, and Russian spiritual space. These are our comrades, those dearest to us, not only colleagues, friends, and people who once served together, but relatives, people bound by blood, by family ties. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land, that is Ukraine, have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. This was the case before the 17th century, when a portion of this territory rejoined the Russian state, and after. There was also a day or two into the war, an op-ed piece that was mistakenly published on the Russian website RIA Novosti, that was supposed to be sort of celebrating the victory that the Russians had supposedly won over against Ukraine, which obviously didn't happen, and the piece was pulled, but not before it was archived. And for those of you who were at the roundtable and I read some of this, I apologize for repeating myself, but I think it's an important piece. In this article, the authors very much echoed Putin in the way he was sort of articulating this geopolitical vision, the tragedy of 1991. There will be no more Ukraine as anti-Russia, and that's not anti-Russian, that's anti-Russia. Russia is restoring its historical fullness, collecting the Russian world, the Russian people together in its entirety of Great Russians, Belarusians, and Little Russians, which is a fairly derogatory term that Russians use to refer to Ukrainians. They argue that the issue of national security, that is the creation of anti-Russia from Ukraine and an outpost for the West to put pressure on us, is only the second most important problem. The first problem is the complex of a divided people and of national humiliation. When the Russian House first lost part of its foundation in Kyiv and was forced to come to terms with the existence of two states, Russia and Ukraine, not one, this was the sort of major problem. And so this is a geopolitical vision in and of itself, in which Ukraine and Ukrainians don't exist, right? They're sort of wayward sheep that need to be returned to the Russian flock. And so what's really at stake here, again, is two competing geopolitical visions in which Ukrainians either exist, Ukrainians and Ukraine either exist as autonomous geopolitical agents, or they don't. And so the question becomes, whose sort of legitimate security concerns actually count here. And I emphasize that bit about anti-Russia, not anti-Russian, because what I think is being referred to here is not the idea of against Russia or hating on Russia or something like that, but something like a geopolitical vision of Russia's mirror image, right? What Yulia Marushevska was trying to say in her video, a democratic, open, rules-based country that really, stands in opposition or at least stands next to the corrupt, authoritarian state that Russia is. And I think you can kind of see this in some of the Russian reactions to other quote unquote color revolutions that have happened in other parts of the former Soviet space. And so Euromaidan then is a way of framing war, at least from the perspective of Russia. It's not so much about NATO, right? It wasn't NATO Maidan, and indeed, and I think maybe one of our next speakers will probably talk about this more, but support for NATO in Ukraine up until the annexation of Crimea in 2014 was like 19 or 20%. I mean, it wasn't going to happen anytime soon, and most Ukrainians were pretty cool on the idea. Now, of course, it's in the high 70s. But Euromaidan really represents a rejection of the sort of subordinate role that it has been assigned in sort of the Russian neo-imperial geopolitical mythos. And so you start to see this idea that kind of comes across almost as just plain propaganda, but I think it's a little bit more insidious, that Euromaidan was actually a Western coup that resulted in the installation of, and you see this all the time, a US-backed Nazi puppet regime that's perpetrating genocide against Russian speakers. And what it's really talking about, right, is this sort of ideologically hostile other, Nazis, that really conveniently resonate, right, with Russia's sort of decades-long rehabilitation of Stalin and sort of the cult of the Great Patriotic War, which, you know, here's some current propaganda that directly links the two. And so if you can accept, or if you can, you know, create this narrative of a, you know, Western coup and Nazis and all of this stuff, what you end up doing is you make Euromaidan and implicitly even the Orange Revolution that happened in 2004 into something other than organic expressions of Ukrainian geopolitical agency, trying to you know, achieve all of those things that Maroshevska was talking about. And if you accept this, right, then it makes the annexation of Crimea legitimate. It legitimizes the creation of the LDNR, these people's republics in Donbass, because they're breaking away from the Nazi regime. There's even this abortive attempt in 2014 to create other people's republics in Kharkiv and Odessa that fail. And of course, it also legitimizes the current war on ideological grounds, not security grounds, right? It's about liberation from Nazis, and it's about historical destiny, about bringing these peoples back into the fold. And again, that article that I mentioned from RIA Novosti makes this quite clear. In the event of the consolidation of the full geopolitical and military control of the West over Ukraine, its return to Russia would become completely impossible. It would have to fight for it with the Atlantic Bloc. In other words, NATO is a problem, but not because Russia feels encircled or backed into a corner. The reason NATO is a problem, hypothetically, is that it would make it difficult for Russia to achieve its historical destiny of gathering all the peoples together and reuniting the Russian lands. And so this brings us then to what's happening in Ukraine right now, the war itself. The initial plans that apparently were to sort of decapitate the Ukrainian government and install a puppet regime obviously failed. A month into the war now, as of tomorrow, the Russian offensive has really not gone anywhere. And sort of these geopolitical and historical, you know, ideological objectives envisioned by the Russian government of, you know, reuniting the Ruski Mir seem pretty unobtainable, right? The Russian military at this point doesn't seem to have the capacity to encircle and capture major Ukrainian cities, particularly Kyiv. Right? It doesn't seem to have the logistical capabilities to do that. Moreover, kind of these fantasies that Russians would be treated as liberators have not been borne out. And, you know, if you paid attention to Ukrainian voices, that's not very surprising, but it seems to have surprised a lot of Russians. Even ordinary Ukrainians are exercising their own geopolitical agency by refusing to accept occupation, by protesting and harassing Russian troops, and killing collaborators in some cases. And they're also sort of asserting a geopolitics of resistance by declaring that Kherson is Ukraine, Crimea is Ukraine, Ukraine is not Russia, Slava Ukraini, in the face of armed invaders and occupiers. They're saying that, no, this is not Ruski Mir, this is Ukraine. And that's exerting geopolitical agency on a very small scale. And so what we're seeing, of course, is sort of this new phase of the war, attrition and devastation. If Ukraine is not going to join the Ruski Mir now, then at the very least we can sort of, or not we, the Russians can cripple it, amputate as much of its territory as possible, destroy as many people as possible, wreck its infrastructure, and hopefully turn it into a failed state that maybe would fall apart on its own, or maybe be easier prey later. And this then kind of gets into a question that perhaps you've seen talked about in you know, the media, is what is happening there right now, a genocide. And I think often we do have the tendency to think of a genocide as nothing more than the you know, literal extirpation of an entire group of people, just murdering every single one of them. And I think that what we see is that's not necessarily what's happening here, but that's not also necessarily the only way of understanding genocide. So Sean Roberts, who's done a lot of work on Uyghur genocide, has said that genocide, and he cites Lemkin here, of course, that genocide is rarely accomplished through the immediate destruction of the group or killing all of them. Instead, it is almost always implemented gradually through the systematic eradication of the group's cultural distinctiveness. So if Ukraine were to join Ruski Mir, that is precisely what is intended, right? Ukraine and Ukrainians don't exist except as wayward Russians. Steve Egbert and myself and several others have talked about these kinds of things in terms of territorial cleansing. I won't read this whole quote because I don't want to run out of time, but it's basically the idea that you're imagining a particular territory and you're imagining that territory without others in it. And Gerard Toll, who is another critical geographer who's talked about this at length, has sort of seen this too. He's argued that the vision, or the Russian geopolitical vision for Ukraine, is radical: to create by military force a new Russian world buffer zone comprising a Ukrainian puppet state, Lukashenko's Belarus, and independent, quote unquote, separatist statelets like Transnistria and the LDNR. Those who actively resist this imperial project are to be killed and driven out. Territories without troubling people. This is Putin's cartographic fantasy in the near abroad, right? The troubling people in this case being Ukrainians. Either you kill them, you drive them out, or you destroy their culture and sort of absorb them into Ruski Mir. And then I just have a couple of other things here. I'm not going to go into any of these in any great depth, but there are a lot of other sort of broader geopolitical implications here as well. 3 million refugees and 10 million displaced Ukrainians, about 25% of the population, most of them women and children. And of course, what's been much remarked upon is how they have met very different responses from Europeans, which is a major problem. There's also the issue of global food security, particularly in the global south, questions about energy. Much of Europe is very much connected to Russian energy sources and may need to rethink that. I think some of our other speakers in other lectures will be talking about nuclear proliferation, so I won't go into that. And I think I'll maybe skip the rest of this stuff just so I'm not out of time. So again, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. And I'm going to now cede the speaker's chair. Okay, it told me the recording stopped and then it said it was in progress. All right. So I'm going to cede the chair then to Dr. Aaron Reddish of the Department of History, and I'll let him take over.
Just a second, I'm just getting my PowerPoint ready here. All right, can you all see that? Cool, all right. Thank you for organizing this roundtable. And my hope is not to talk too long, so we'll have a chance to have kind of a discussion. And what I'm going to talk about kind of builds off what Vincent was just discussing, and that is the important rhetorical, I would actually say kind of a real device of anti-fascism and the memory of the Second World War in Russia's justification for the war in Ukraine. That is, to understand what's going on now, we need to look at the real rhetoric of Putin about the Second World War, and to take what people have called propaganda seriously. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to, by way of conclusion, talk about something that is actually amorphous or without substance, and that is the Z or the Z campaign, which hopefully supports rather than undermines. The war in Ukraine is about geopolitics. It's about contested national identity, history, personalities, economics, mass mobilization, etc. And there are many more angles that need to be discussed, that is, using evidence rather than kind of tweets. things that we need to just kind of study. The war itself, that is military formations and operations, of which there's a lot of conversation, but not enough evidence. Everyday life in the locales of Ukraine, Ukrainian voices, and within that you have, based on socioeconomics, gender, locales, the deep economic impact from sanctions of war, from sanctions and on war, including how the sanctions and the war are going to affect specific countries in the global south. We're going to see that in the next couple months. The movement of peoples and how the current war, as Vincent just said, is showing, I would actually say, remarkable similarities to attitudes on refugees that we saw with the civil war in Syria. So I could go on and on. Right now, I'd like to talk about the development of Russia's justification for its what Putin calls a special military operation, what everyone else calls a war or an invasion. It's a term that's used to mobilize Russia. It's a term to delegitimize Ukraine and its soldiers. And again, something that we need to talk more about, it's also used for legal reasons to allow Russia not to follow specific international law and international human rights on war, on how to treat prisoners of war. Interestingly, these international rights are things that Russia itself championed in the late 19th century. Russia was actually some of the first in the world to champion these rights, and now they're going back on it. So I'm not going to focus on what is factual, that is what is actually right, and more talk about the rhetoric of it. Okay, so on February 24th, at this speech that you see here, Putin justified the special operation in several kind of different ways. He talked about the eastward expansion of NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union, that Ukraine was not a legitimate nation, that it was a gift by Lenin and the Bolsheviks in 1917, and that this was a part of decommunization, that the revolution of Euromaidan was not legitimate. This is exactly what Vince was just talking about, that was fueled by Western support, and that it was supported pro-fascism in Ukraine. All of this was important, but it hinged, I would say, around the experience of the Second World War for Russia. The Ukrainian government was oppressing Russians, Putin argued, inside Ukraine and was threatening genocide. And he was using rhetoric or symbols that he himself was familiar with, but that he thought that other Russians would understand because of kind of the narrative that the Soviets and then the post-Soviets, and especially Putin, had been formulating. So he has this quote, what next? This is what he says. What are we to expect? If history is any guide, actually I cannot see, here we go. If history is any guide, we know that in 1914 and early 1941, the Soviet Union went to great lengths to prevent war, or at least to delay its outbreak. The attempt to appease the aggressor ahead of the Great Patriotic War proved to be a mistake, which came at a high cost for our people. We will not make this mistake the second time. We have no right to do so. This is what he said when he was declaring the beginning of the special operation, what he called. So this is something that is, so he then said the goal was demilitarization, anti-fascism, but it was one that is, that contrasts Russia as defensive and Ukraine / the West as the aggressor. Very much kind of the same rhetoric as the Second World War. He concluded the goal of the war, of the special operations, will be to defend people who for 8 years are suffering persecution and genocide by the Kiev regime. For this, we will aim for demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine, as well as taking to court those who carried out multiple bloody crimes against civilians, including citizens of the Russian Federation. And this last part about taking people to court is itself going back to a kind of reimagining Nuremberg. The mobilization of the Second World War is central, has been central to Putin's political ideology. And Ukraine is, what's going on right now in Ukraine is a radical extension of that. Right, how do you get to this? I would say it starts with this. The history of a memory of anti-fascism in Russia begins in the 1930s as the Nazis are kind of trying to expand their influence. You can see this in the language of Stalin in the 1930s, that the Soviets are the first and the only power to stand against fascism. This was part of the rhetoric when it supported kind of the anti-fascists in Spain. And you see this in Komsomol literature in the 1930s. The war was central to Soviet memory, in part because of the huge loss of life, right? The 27 million or more who were killed, which shaped individuals and shaped a collective identity, not just of the generation who survived the war, but their children and their grandchildren, right? This is their children is Putin, right? The victory, so goes the political argument, justified the collective sacrifice and came from working together, came from this collectivism. And this memory of the Second World War was the only thing that held Russia together after communism fell apart. You don't need communism to show Russian unity. And it was this that justified, that is the victory of the Second World War, justified Russia's global strength. So May 9th, Victory Day, is now the most important national holiday. And for Putin, it is what justifies his reign. As Elizabeth Wood has shown, World War II has become a mythical, untouchable episode, the central World War II, the central 20th century event. It's what makes Russia great. It justifies its world power and its humanitarianism. It is the conqueror of fascism, and Putin personifies this legacy, right? When Yeltsin turned over the keys to Putin, he said, "Take care of Russia," and Putin has kind of taken that as right. This has led to this, right? This is last year on Red Square. You could be mistaken thinking that this is 1945, and that's the whole point, right? That is supposed to be this this reimagining. It was World War II that helped shift the gaze from the debacle of Chechnya, right? That he used World War II to kind of reimagine the military. And Putin has always used it to help him justify, when he talks about Russia's need to defend ethnic Russians against the pressures abroad, he says it's for humanitarian efforts, that he goes back to the Second World War. And this language was intensified in 2008, that it helped delegitimize the Ukrainian revolution by the Soviet Union's focus on the far right, on the fascist parties, on the references to the Ukrainian insurgent army, to Stepan Bandera, later to the Azov battalion, calling the Revolution of Dignity a coup. So you see this language already there, right? It's already there that kind of justifies 2022. Between 2008 and the present, you actually see a tightening of the narrative on the Second World War. There are more historical works on the greatness of the Soviet effort in the Second World War, basically underscoring the idea of solidarity, that there was nobody who went against the war. And last year, in 2021, it became a crime to deny the decisive effort of the Soviet Union in the defeat of the Nazis, right? So you already have history not only becoming kind of usable, but also legal. So in this way, the war against Ukraine is an extension of the myth of World War II and denazification. And you see this with, all right, so this was yesterday, right? The Brotherhood of Slavic Peoples Without Nazism. This is in something that propaganda that Russian army soldiers used in, I think it was at Kharkiv, or was it Kherson? It was one of the other. So there are a lot of, Putin has a lot of kind of comments to talk about how the current war is anti-fascism. But just yesterday, Boris Gryzlov, the Russian ambassador to Belarus, speaking on the anniversary of the 1943 Katyn massacre, in which a battalion that had many Ukrainians in it, but many Russians as well, burned a village in Belarus, killing about 150 people for supporting partisans. He made this speech in Belarus. He said, "Now the germs of fascism have sprung up again in Ukraine under the leadership of the de facto official authorities of Kiev." Kiev rather than Kiev. Have sprung up again, all right. Under the de facto official authorities of Kiev, marches and torchlight processions were held in honor of the unfinished Nazis. This didn't happen. The coup d'etat that took place in 2014, in fact, plunged Ukraine into a civil war. The Donbass did not accept this anti-Russian project. They had no other choice because fascist pogroms swept across Ukraine. And on May 2nd, 2014, a tragedy occurred in Odessa when dozens of people were burned in the house of trade unions. In fact, it was Katyn of the 21st century, right? That Ukraine is basically fascist, and that Russians are experiencing the same that Belarusians experienced during the war. We must keep the memory of the Great Patriotic War alive and not allow the revival of fascism, right? This is clearly using the Second World War to mobilize Belarus. Russian news have talked about Ukrainian doctors promoting violence and evoking Eichmann. You see Kadyrov just recently linking the end of World War II with this war, saying that the spring, as a rule, brings victory over fascism. And as he says, this is symbolic, linking the two together. Okay. One of the things about this is that the Kremlin has banned any use of the word war, and has tried to kind of dominate the rhetoric on the news outlets. It's banned Twitter, it's regulated Facebook, Instagram, etc. In part, this allows the Russian government to define what is anti-fascism, what is fascism, and helps it to define the rhetoric. There is a strong resistance to that, which I'll come to at the very end. But one of the absurdities of this has been the development of the Z campaign. And I call this kind of this conclusion, all that's air becomes a solid. So in the first days of war, the letter Z became viral. At first, commenters tried to tie it to World War II and anti-fascism, Z standing for Za Pobyedu, that is for victory. Then we actually found that was denoting a military district, a letter made on military vehicles made by soldiers. But in fact, it's much like its meaning only comes from the context of the current war, right? So some news commentators have called the war Operation Z, and it has fed on itself. Z is now Russia. It now represents strength, popular mobilization. The fact that it's using a Latin letter to fight the West, right? That is taking symbols of the West to use it to fight against itself. So in this way, Z, which could stand for zebra, zoo park, whatever, stands in many ways for this, right? Za Rosil, using the Z, za meaning for or behind. And you see that it has been used by outside the state to tie it to the St. George ribbon, denoting victory of the World War II. So this is nationalist mobilization, but without a concrete meaning. The emptiness of the brand Z shows in some ways the emptiness of the war itself. Let me end by the dialectic here. And that's the resistance within Russia that has kind of made its point through its absence. In contrast or not, Russian protest sign went from stating the obvious, "Нет войны," no war, actually harkens back to Soviet propaganda against the war. And I promise this is where I'm ending. It then went from this to this, right? As the word war was banned, as people were arrested, even signs that said 2 words were arrested. Now even this, the blankness, leads to people being arrested. The meaning for both is in the unstated, but the known, the popular. While Z comes from kind of state or popular rhetoric and disseminated, and it gets meaning through its mass popular participation, blank signs come from the people against the state and through individual, spontaneous, surreptitious acts. This, in many ways, is just as powerful, that is, the dialectic is just as powerful as this and this. And I'll end with that.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I like that. What did you say? All that is air becomes solid, or something. That was, I like that. So our final speaker for the evening will be Natalie Melnichuk, who I believe will be talking about NATO and some things of that nature. So without further ado, I'll turn it over, and then after that, we will have some time for discussion and questions. So Natalie.
Thank you. I was really happy to hear that we could move from Vincent's geopolitical vision to Aaron's rhetoric, because now I bring you perceptions, false perceptions, accurate perceptions, misperceptions, all put together in what we now have as an extreme historical critical juncture for Euro-Atlantic security and probably for global security as well. So all of the trigger words that Vincent and Aaron have been using play a significant part in what we have today. And to put either my biases or credentials right on the table for you, I came from almost 8 years in Ukraine. I worked on a USAID project heading up the Parliamentary Development Project. So working on democratization of Ukraine. That was in '94. Before that, I was with the Ukrainian Social Studies Research Institute that did a lot of political polling data, very important for what I'm going to reveal in my discussion. And after those experiences, I then became the head of what was the very first NATO office outside of NATO, opened in Ukraine. I was not the first head. I was the third head after it was open for only 2 years. The first ambassador from Canada who headed up the office died violently and rather suddenly. as seemed to be kind of the course of events of the day at that time. Quite a few leading political Democratic leaders were either having vicious car accidents or heart attacks. In the case of the first head of the NATO Information and Documentation Center, NIDC, Ambassador Roman Lashinsky also faced a car accident, a very tragic one involving a double semi from Hungary that came somehow out of the forest, not even off a road, and drove at a 90-degree angle across the highway. Very similar to the old Democratic leader, Vyacheslav Chornovil, who met with the same fate coming home from the airport one night. But in any case, all of that for background. I do not start looking at the current situation or Russia's invasion of Ukraine as having started around 2014 or 2008. Indeed, I think it began around 2001, if not 1991. So I take you back, come along for the journey. 30 years of misperceptions and misunderstandings. First of all, the misperceptions are both of Russia and of Ukraine by the West. I cannot speak for the rest of the Southern Hemisphere, if you will, but definitely for NATO, the OSCE, the UN, and probably for Washington, DC, and for Ottawa, we were undervaluing what we should have valued. And we were looking at distorted pictures of these two countries. Some signals we weren't able to receive, and other signals were distorted. Very dangerous, I think, for any type of honest relationship, certainly when you have nuclear weapons and security involved. So two problems. First, seeing Ukraine through the eyes of the Kremlin yielded an unclear, distorted, and partial picture of Ukraine. Yet seeing Russia through the eyes of the Kremlin also yielded an unclear, distorted, and partial picture. So the West was pretty shocked when 4 weeks ago tomorrow, Putin's Russia invaded Ukraine. They really should not have been. Russia was shocked at Ukraine's formidable and energetic defense, its resilience, and its unified resolve to keep on racing towards the EU and NATO, battling for its independence as Russian troops poured in. But again, Russia shouldn't have been surprised. So I think a lot of what Vincent and Aaron were saying regarding the vision and the rhetoric have really been mucking about with reality for at least 30 years. But again, Aaron mentioned the word dialectics. When we look at dialectics, reading between the lines, this is an old art form used actively by the Soviet Union, if not even before the Soviet period. Catherine the Great had some tremendous quotes about trickery for purposes of manipulation. So long history there. And indeed, some of that rhetoric had its intended effect, especially the more propagandistic or misleading rhetoric. But all of that combined to get us to where we are today. There's an undertone there as well, moving from my work with NATO to democratization, which I've done with a variety of nations. The notion of institutions, legitimacy, and the connection between democratic societies and institutional legitimacy. There's a lot to be said on all of it, but I think where it bears mentioning here is that democracy, by its very composition, requires buy-in from all levels of society, civil society, government. In every way, shape, and form, democracy has to be the creation of society and in the control of society, ideally. We all know the caveats and exceptions. However, that necessarily means that there is some sort of buy-in into the system by an entire citizenry. Whether or not they participate is their choice, But by buying in or by acquiescing or by participating or not participating, the citizens create a legitimate system. That means they're along for the ride. If suddenly a war is proclaimed, they're probably more likely to go along because they've probably been forging policy to some degree along the way. And we all know the institutional mechanisms that exist for that, ability to express and to form associational groups autonomously, freedom of press, media, all rights we fight for here in the US every day. But if you take that to be one of the great misperceptions about Ukraine, a country that's been building its democracy bit by bit by bit since 91, and if you realize that since 91, the Ukrainian government has been asking for NATO membership and EU membership. And if you realize that Ukraine had a very robust first partnership for peace action plan. Ukraine was the first NATO partner, the first. And I think we had 40 partners at a certain point. But Ukraine was the one who pushed NATO so hard for membership. And NATO really didn't know what Ukraine was yet. And it was dealing with the obvious contenders for membership right away. So Ukraine wound up forging this partnership for peace. Shortly thereafter, Russia joined and many other countries joined. Ukraine had the first partnership action program. It was a fairly detailed document, but it showed what was required to actually become compatible with NATO. And those compatibilities are very much in line with democratic structures and institutions, economic free markets, and of course, compatible military and security structures. Within each of those categories, there are many, many subcategories. Ukraine didn't measure up to that. It was not going to be a short-term pathway to NATO, but the door was open. So you have a country that at the government level, except for that shaky Yanukovych period, the middle 2000s and onward to around 2014, there was a lot of competition within the government. That one could actually trace fairly clearly to a Russian change in its security demands. So up until 2001, Russia was somewhat of a benign force on the stage of Ukraine's foreign and security policy. In 2001, there was a significant shift with Putin. I don't know what was happening in the Kremlin, but in 2001, very publicly, Putin's sort of new policy was being revealed. And in some of the discussions that we had publicly, we saw the Russian ambassador, who was doing a fine job, but an average ambassador, pulled out of Ukraine, and Viktor Chernomyrdin was brought in quickly. There wasn't the usual changeover of ambassadors. It was a rapid shift. Chernomyrdin had what we can only call an extravaganza of welcome as he took over the Philharmonic, had the Russian double-eagled flag draped on three sides of the Philharmonic, and then proceeded to have the Russian Philharmonic fly in, play on the stage some kind of nostalgic Soviet songs, pieces. And in that, he announced several things: that Russia is now very interested in Ukraine economically. And if anybody is thinking of talking about Ukraine and NATO, they should speak to the Kremlin, because it would only be through the Kremlin that Ukraine would enter NATO. That was mind-blowing. My mind is still blown today. What is the significance here? It's exactly what Aaron was positing. You've really got two very different worldviews going on. Russia envisioning its place in the world and the place of other sovereign nations in its world, whereas those outside of Russia have moved on. For some of them, they've moved back. Many of these former Soviet republics were, of course, independent countries throughout time. They were bounced in and out of the Russian Empire. And mind you, legitimacy, the word legitimacy is so crucial. When you take over a nation or you cripple it or partially destroy it and say, the only way this will stop is if you sign this piece of paper, oftentimes those nations sign. So whether by sheer brute force or by coercion, many of these republics or countries were going in and out of the Russian sphere. So it's not as if Ukraine was born in 1991, and they have a memory in Ukraine, and they have documents of their independence. So that lives within the political culture and history. And by the way, Ukraine had the first democratic constitution of Europe. It didn't last for very long. The country didn't last for very long, but it was based upon something. It was based upon an existent political culture, an intellectual culture, and being right there in Europe, a European culture. So it's not surprising that survived, especially persecution has a way of magnifying one's memory and capability to hold on to it. But now we move fast forward because we see Russia acting and intervening actively from about 2001 forward. It seems to me many perhaps didn't notice their obstacle creation on the outside, but the way they worked within the NATO-Russia Council, it was clear that they liked discussing Ukraine at the NATO-Russia Council, and NATO, all the members, and Russia would do that. It feels rather uncomfortable to think about sovereign countries not being at the table when they're being discussed by other countries. Again, this lack of agency discomfort. Who is Ukraine that we can push it around where we want to? But these determined democratic forces, Western forces in Ukraine, they survived the turbulent period of the 2000s, again, around 2001. It begins really bad by 2008, 2010, 2012. The culmination in 2014, somehow Ukraine was able to hold on to its European aspirations. They were about to sign a long-awaited document with the EU, and the Russian-backed president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, decided to withdraw at the last moment and instead simultaneously accepted relationship document with Russia that really hadn't been debated and really hadn't been the way of the country. And by the way, in the early 1990s, there are plenty of public opinion polls. The Cave Institute for Social Science Research or Democratic Initiatives Foundation in the name of Ilko Kucherev displays pretty high numbers in favor of NATO membership from the populace. Why is that important? That's actually one of the requirements of NATO, that the populace needs to back and support entering NATO. So it was quite the heyday the first 10 years of independence from 91, and then things started going downhill from that. So we know the story of what happened 4 weeks ago, Russia moving in, the 190,000 troops, decapitation of government predicted within 48 to 72 hours. None of that has happened yet. However, the geostrategic and the security alliance implications are, as Ursula von der Leyen of the EU said today, they are rocking Europe. They are rocking Europe. If Europe is rocking, it means North America is rocking. And it also means that Russia is probably rocking because we are all intertwined. And the security of Europe is as much a concern to Russia as it is to North America. And so given that reality, it's extraordinary what's happened in the last 4 weeks. Putin thought that he was going to be moving in and achieving all of his goals rapidly. Instead, he seems to have achieved a counter reality, perhaps some of his worst dreams. His goal was, of course, to force into place a government in one way or another run by Russia through the Kremlin, whether it was a puppet governor, a suzerainty, just a destroyed territory with perhaps no Ukrainians on it because they can be a bit of a pain to rule. And that didn't quite work out for them. Putin hoped to divide and weaken the EU, divide and weaken the Euro-Atlantic bond, NATO, frighten other countries from joining NATO, in this case, Finland and Sweden. And he was hoping to increase Russia's standing vis-a-vis the United States and China. He's really envisioning a multipolar world of China, US, and Russia. That was truly what he thought was achievable, moving not only towards Ukraine, but perhaps not even stopping with Ukraine. But there's some evidence to show he has desires or aspirations to move further west. Much like this odd Z logo, I'm not quite certain what it means yet. I know what they're saying, but there's also on a lot of the missiles and tanks, they're writing on Russian or in Russian on the Russian tanks and missiles, na Berlin, we're going all the way to Berlin. So maybe it's just a few renegade artists putting out graffiti, but I'm not quite certain how serious that thinking was. In any case, Putin's invasion has brought him exactly what he didn't want. Ukraine's national identity, modern national identity, has been so strengthened and so coalesced. It is now more clearly separate from Russia than we would have perceived previously. Ukraine has also demonstrated it's prepared to fight. It's ready to sacrifice all they have, die for independence, freedom, self-determination, democracy, and their place in the Euro-Atlantic family. It's considered a role model for Europe at this point, and perhaps in some ways, for all of those trying to protect or strengthen their democracies. What is it really worth to you to preserve it? Putin's also managed to unite the EU, potentially even enlarge the EU. The pan-European umbrella has been strengthened. Everything from sheltering the 3 million refugees of Ukraine. Europe has closely bonded through this humanitarian disaster. And Europe is now remilitarizing. All of these nations that started cutting defense budgets in '91, they are all now in conference at NATO and of course publicly saying that they're going to strive for the 2% of their GDP to go into their own defense. They are strengthening the Euro-Atlantic relationship. When the new countries joined since '91 to NATO, NATO had a pledge not to put a forward military presence into these countries of a permanent nature or even rotational nature. Now at the NATO Extraordinary Summit of Heads of State tomorrow, they're putting that on the table because already the BTG groups have been moved into nearly all 8 of the new Eastern flank members of NATO. And that is something that NATO promised not to do. But unfortunately, the documents, all of that was promised in, did have an out clause that if the security arrangement would deem it necessary at some point to do it, they could do it. But Russia has smashed that agreement along with quite a few others in international law. And so the document between NATO and Russia is considered void at this time. So tomorrow, NATO's discussing both rotational and permanent stationing of these battle groups. So that would include about 40,000 soldiers along the eastern flank. That's a huge change. And it means time and money and human resources are being spent that the West definitely would not have spent. Nobody had an appetite for any of this in the West. And that was probably one of the reasons they didn't want to see exactly what was happening in Russia or the Kremlin over the last 10, 15 years. It's really requiring a lot of fast action on the part of the EU, NATO, the UN is taking many meetings, the OSCE is basically paralyzed. Every international organization, or of the ones that I just mentioned, those that function by consensus and those where Russia holds a seat, they have been used to either stymie or support some of Russia's security moves in the last 20 years or so. In the OSCE, it's beyond being the arsonist and the firefighter. You have Russia with a seat in a body of 57. That includes the EU and NATO and other organizations that have a seat. I think it's 50 national seats plus organizations. But you can only operate under 100% consensus. And so when peacekeeping forces or the observer mission of the OSCE were sent into Eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, they were very much co-formulated with Russia. So you actually had, and right up until the war, well, shortly before then, you actually had Russian soldiers in the peacekeeping forces of Russian-occupied, Russian-backed separatists. There's so many adjectives for this one, Luhansk and Donetsk. And it is rather mind-boggling to think that the one promoting a war would be part of the peacekeeping contingent on the foreign soil that it's invaded. So we've seen a lot of peculiar permutations because of NATO, Russia's aspirations, because of their positions within the UN and the OSCE. Many people are talking about changing some of the institutional structures or procedures for decision-making. That's huge. I don't know where that's going to go. To change something like that is going to take a great deal of discussion, but I know my time is up. There's so much more to say, but I think we are seeing the difference between perhaps a mostly illegitimate authoritarian regime taking on what turns out to be a small, relatively small, newish democracy with aspirations of freedom and formally moving into the West. And you see how very different they are. But as President Biden said last week, it is a struggle that pits the appetites of an autocrat against humankind's desire to be free. And I think that this war is clearly changing our security structures in Europe right now. This week, actually, we'll have a lot of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was really interesting. I actually learned an awful lot about the immediately post 1991 period that I absolutely had no idea about. That was really fascinating. We do have about 15 minutes now for Q&A. And I did want to reiterate something I put in the chat, but in case people didn't see it, we do actually have one extra speaking slot, I believe, on April 6th. So if you are a Wayne State faculty member or a member of the Ukrainian or Ukrainian American community here, and now that you've sort of seen the format, you feel like you would like to jump in and take part on April 6th, please get in touch with me. We would love to have you because we only have 2 speakers on that day, and the more the merrier, and the more perspectives and the more speakers I think will just only enrich this. So with the Q&A period, I guess maybe use the little hand up emoji button if you can, and we can unmute you and you can ask it. or type it in the chat. And I'm actually going to go back to a question that Dr. Pearson asked earlier. Let's see. Just because I think it's an important one. How do we classify and account for groups like Right Sector and Stronghold and Azov in Ukraine today? And I'll go ahead and just open that up to anyone who wants to answer that. And then we will go to Dr. Saperstein, who looks like he has his hand up. Okay, I guess I'll throw in my views about Azov and all of that. I think it's pretty clear, obviously, that there exists an extreme right in Ukraine, a nationalist movement, some of which borders or simply is sort of neo-Nazism. I also think it's pretty clear that in the sort of grand scheme of Ukrainian politics, these groups are fairly minor. They have no real support in the broader population, and they certainly have not done well over the last several years in Ukrainian politics or in parliament. That said, I do have fears that, there is a terrible war raging in Ukraine right now, and terrible wars of, extermination and that sort of thing have a tendency to enable and make the far right worse and more powerful. So I do have fears about what the post-war landscape in Ukraine will look like politically. And I think maybe the best that we can do is to continue to support liberal democratic parties in the country to help rebuild the country financially and in terms of infrastructure, because these I think are the kinds of things that disable far right and extremist parties. But I don't really have any, I think, unique insights into that. If Aaron or Natalie do, please jump in, and then we'll go to Dr. Saperstein, who I will unmute in just a moment.
I would just add that, the extremism, political right-wing extremism and anti-Semitism is part of Ukrainian history, and it's part of its nation building. It's Ukraine is not perfect. It is, much like every nation state, flawed. And that's okay. And that's also part of, I think, multi-ethnic communities, that there are histories of both cooperation and violence. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I think at the same time, I think what Vincent said, that they are marginalized is important, but it's also part of the story. It's not what the Kremlin says. That is, it's not the driving force of Ukrainian nationalism, but it's part of the history.
Absolutely, yeah, I think that's exactly right. Okay, I'm going to unmute Dr. Saperstein here. I don't know if I have the power to actually unmute you, but you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
There we go. I just wanted to add a little bit of history that I recall to what Dr. Redditch was talking about. He talked about the anti-fascist history of the Soviet Union and the strong feelings of anti-fascism at World War II and before. I'd like to remind him that a good part of the German Panzer technology was developed in the Moscow tank school. Guderian studied in Moscow in the early 30s. I also like to remind him of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, I guess, where the two countries decided to divvy up Poland between them. So it's true, of course, that they also fought against Franco in Spain, but it's a very mixed history. This anti-fascism is not pure Soviet doctrine. The other thing I want to point out is that Putin, of course, keeps talking about Ukraine as a made-up state. But the interesting thing is that under Stalin, Ukraine was declared an independent nation to join the United Nations. That is, that when the United Nations was formed Ukraine was considered, was demanded to be an independent nation. Otherwise, the Soviet Union was not going to come in.
Yeah, I would just add that, what I was talking about it's rhetoric. I mean, it's not, it's certainly not fact. I mean, there's, you could add more things that Russia and Germany in the 1920s were allies for part of the times, that Nazi scientists worked alongside Soviet scientists in the Far East. And there's a lot of messiness. I mean, besides what was going on in the Spanish Civil War, how Stalin dealt with socialists who actually allied with them against fascism. But it's more that what I was saying is that this is a story, right? That the Soviets created and were very good at mobilizing. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it with that.
Are there any other questions or comments or anything anyone wants to bring up? Now is the time. We still got about 10 minutes. All right. Well, somebody actually asked earlier, again in the chat, whether or not we thought that if Ukraine had declared its interest in NATO to be null and void, that it had given up on those plans. Right before the invasion, I saw a lot of supposedly very learned people in the Atlantic magazine and other outlets talking about Finlandization, and how Ukraine should accept Finlandization, whether this would have prevented the war. And I think that the answer is more complex than just yes or no. I think in terms of would it have perhaps prevented the outbreak of this conflict right now in the way that we are seeing it? Perhaps. Would it have prevented the ultimate incorporation of Ukraine into Ruski Mir by hook or crook? No, I don't think so. And don't forget, right, that Ukraine was under invasion since 2014. And that was in response to Euromaidan, not NATO Maidan, right? The Ukrainian desire to look west, to join the rules-based international order that the EU represents, that is what bothers Putin and the Russian government, not necessarily just NATO. The idea that Ukraine is, like I said, rejecting its assigned role as a sort of Russian satrapy or vassal, that is the problem. And so I think ultimately what we may have seen, and I don't like to sort of do, speculative fiction, so I'm not going to go down that pipe too far, but I think what ultimately we might have seen, and perhaps what we were already seeing during the Yanukovych era, is something akin to what has progressively happened in Belarus, whereby, for all intents and purposes at this point, Belarus is a Russian vassal. Lukashenko has no real, I think, independence at this point. Russian troops are occupying his country. According to the new constitution that was just signed a couple of weeks ago, Russian nuclear weapons are now able to be positioned on Belarusian territory, and now there are signs that Russian officers are commanding Belarusian military detachments that may cross the border or not into Ukraine, which I think from the Belarusian perspective, at least from Lukashenko's perspective, would be a disaster, because his military is about the only thing between him and the gallows, I think, at this point. And I want to make a little shout out to the Belarusian people who have been sabotaging rail networks and things like that to prevent Russian detachments and supplies from getting into Ukraine, which takes quite a bit of bravery in a country like Belarus that is controlled by a dictator. So, sorry, somebody wrote in the chat. what does Maidan mean? I'm talking about the Euromaidan revolution or the revolution of dignity that happened in 2013, 2014, where people occupied this place that's right behind me in my picture here. That's in Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine. There is a really excellent, if you have Netflix, documentary called Winter on Fire that I think everyone should watch. One of the most moving documentaries about the Euromaidan revolution that I can think of. And it was really sparked by the Yanukovych government's refusal to pursue further integration with the European Union, which had been agreed upon and passed by the Ukrainian parliament, I think, several months earlier. So again, the Maidan moment, the revolution of dignity, was not spurred by NATO. It was spurred by trying to get closer to the European Union, and that's what spurred the annexation of Crimea and the amputation of the people's republics in the East. And I think that's really important to remember. This has been happening long before the present moment. Alina Klein had her hand up, so I will.
Okay, thank you. That's really very interesting presentations, extremely interesting. And thank you for answering my question. That's what I thought too, that NATO was sort of a pretext, that they were giving it up would not change much at this point. But my question, I have two questions. One question is about, and I don't remember because my understanding is that Russia never wanted to be a part of the EU. And it seems to me, but I don't know, maybe they expressed that aspiration at a certain point, I just don't remember. Because I seem to think that long term, the only way to sort of diffuse Russia would have been like this old saying has it, keep your friends close but your enemies closer, and sort of the West kind of missed it during this 30 years. And that's why we have what we have, this tragedy. So that's my question. Was it ever aspiration, or it was always Russia being so big and so imperialistic or imperial? And also I have another question, which is, do you see any real shifts in the Russian population towards really being against that war, or this propaganda still is so strong that it's just not really very big yet? Thank you.
I would be happy to try and take those. First of all, gathering public opinion in Russia has been difficult in the best of times, although they became quite good at it in the early 2000s. But the data that is coming out now over the last week, Russian popular support for the war is going up. But you have to realize that, of course, people know that when they're being asked a question, their identity is probably also front and center. So if they say they don't support it, I have little doubt that these are not anonymous polls, even if they tell the Russians they are. So there is this constant fear of actually expressing yourself. During the Soviet period, everyone was a master of the dialectic of self-censorship. It was a matter of survival, and it hasn't been difficult to resurrect that. They only had about 10 to 15 years of a real chance at freedom of speech there from 91 onward. And then the media clampdown began already more than a decade ago. So alternative sources of information, meaning alternative abilities to express alternative viewpoints to the government or to Putin's Kremlin, became extremely difficult. So people have been feeding off of the Russian government's line primarily for over a decade. It's become particularly bad and limited the last few years. So public support actually may be growing. A lot of the independent journalists have now fled in the last week, 10 days, going to Armenia, to the Baltics, to Uzbekistan, anywhere they can go, because they're pretty sure they're going to be on that list of who needs to be targeted for some serious questioning, if not worse. So when you don't have that open media source, when your internet is blocked, your Google is blocked, your, I think Telegram might still be working there, but there's very little alternative source of information. Once you go east of Moscow, you know, Russia is 3 times wider than the United States, I think 9 time zones. And you have fewer and fewer cables. Internet is still cable based. So a lot of people have been not that connected to the information space anyway, the global information space. So on the other hand, we also had the highest defection within the Kremlin early this morning in Russia. So quite a long time ago, almost 20 hours ago, in protest against the war. So Putin is losing some of his close inner circle. Some of the oligarchs are speaking up against him. That's going to signal the Russian populace. You may see opinion changing. Whether or not they'll feel safe to express it is another question. The other question about Russia expressing an interest in joining the EU, I'm not familiar with that. Russia certainly expressed an interest in possibly joining NATO. When Ukraine opened its office, again, first of its kind with NATO, Russia immediately demanded one of its own. A NATO official mission of NATO to Russia was opened less than 12 months later in Moscow. Incredible, right? I mean, an official office there. And for NATO, it was only its second office, Ukraine being the first. They were very active within NATO. The way NATO is physically structured, every member nation and every partner nation has their own embassy, their own mission to NATO. Some of these can contain 400 political and military representatives. These are vast. The Russian mission to NATO was huge. Now it's down to about 10 because their partnership became more and more limited after the 2014 invasion of Crimea and the East. But I think you're right that NATO and Russia were trying to figure out a way to cooperate in a mutual, respectful, and probably even-handed way. But within NATO, Russia, if Russia would have become a member, it would have been an equal partner to 30 other nations, one of 31. It wouldn't have been top dog, and it wouldn't have been just Russia and Ukraine, which is often how, or Russia and the US, which is how Russia often sees the whole geostrategic balance in the Northern Hemisphere. They need to be an equal to the US or none of it matters below that level. So I don't think they were satisfied at NATO.
Okay, thank you for that, Natalie. I hate to cut things off, but it is now 7:32, so we are slightly over time, and I do want to make sure that I respect everybody's time. So I'm going to have to cut things short here. I have pasted in the chat window the email addresses for our 3 speakers today. So if you have any other further questions, feel free to email us. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture, but someone also has just posted in the chat, we do have another peace vigil at Wayne State University at Gulen Mall on March 31st, which is next Thursday, not this Thursday, from 5 to 6 p.m. So we hope to see you all there. I'm very glad that everyone was able to make it to this, and we hope to see you at the upcoming lectures as well. And we will disseminate information about how to get the recording of the lecture, should you want it, as soon as we can. So thanks again. I hope you all have a lovely evening, and Slava Ukraini.